I was born on a train on Trans-Siberian Railroad. My father was on service, military service in Manchuria. And so he called my mother and 3 of the children to come over to join him. And as you know, the trip is very long. It's about 12 days to cross from Moscow to Vladivostok. So I was shaken out of the womb by the Lake Baikal.
We first met Nureyev. I believe it was a dinner or something. I think it was sort of 1974. And I immediately said, would you ever let me do drawings of you? Would you ever pose? And he sort of said, of course not. I have no time. And that was sort of it. There was nothing more I was going to be able to say to convince him. And well, then I sort of became obsessed with this idea. Could I paint this dancer? And the whole thing was a contradiction in terms. Dance is movement, painting is static. So that even more intrigued me. And as I'd mentioned, Lincoln Kirstein had become a big figure in my life. And so I remember first going to Kirstein and saying, is there any way that you could help me? He, of course, the world of ballet was his world. And he had no interest in Nureyev. And so that completely backfired. And Kirstein, even I recall so well, Kirstein got so rather upset. And why are you interested in Nureyev? He's the prince. You don't need to be interested in that. You should be interested in dancers and the form and the bodies and so forth. Anyway, that drove me even more on to wanting to. And then, quite amazingly, I guess 3 years later, we were at something, and he came up and said, are you still interested in doing something with me or of me? And I immediately said, well, of course. He said, well, I am here, and I am performing at the Met or whatever. And so that began it. At the time, Nureyev was performing on Broadway, in a Broadway theater, which was sort of unusual for a dancer to fill a Broadway theater. And so the mechanics of it, we would go before the performance to the theater, through the stage door into it, and then he would go through this process of makeup and making up, and I would sit there and just do studies of him. He was playing Pierrot Lunaire at the time, so he had white makeup, pure white on his face. And the stage would be cleared. Nobody was allowed on stage. He then would go out and start warming up. In other words, doing turns, doing pirouettes, doing the sort of ballet movements. And beyond the curtain, you could hear the orchestra warming up, and then you could hear the house starting to fill. And it was just, to me, it was what the world of performing arts was about. I would sit there in his house, and he would come out this figure in white makeup, and he had warm-up sort of things on heavy clothing to sort of warm up. But it was more of a psychological thing for him. He was getting into the role of this character. And he would do these sort of spins, and he got more and more kind of maniacal looking. As in the breathing, heavy breathing as he was getting in this thing. And finally, he would reach this sort of fever pitch, and he would rush off stage, and Luigi, his masseur, would be there with a heavy coat to put around to keep him warm, and he'd go to the dressing room. He took class every morning. After, opening night, he'd be in the next morning at 7 o'clock at the bar. And he would be there in class with all these kids, of course. And he'd come in looking like a ragamuffin. And I love watching these kids when they finally realize, oh my God, it's Rudolf Nureyev who is taking class with us. Anyway, one day I picked a dancer who had a body rather similar to Rudolph's. So I thought, I'm going to get this guy to pose. And then I'll put Rudolph's head on the body. And so I went to this young guy, and he said, oh, yes, I'd love to. I'll come to your studio. And, 3 days later, we were standing there, Rudolph was there, and I explained to Rudolph, I said, obviously you have no time, so I've asked this boy to pose. And he flew into this rage and said, those piggy legs for my legs, that body for mine, never, And really, due to that, and it wasn't by design of mine, he then gave me a lot more time. Rudolf reappeared and looked at what I was working on today, again, I'm sure he'd be critical about, well, you know, that leg more beautiful and this and that. But I think he'd get a sense of the interpretiveness that I've done, and I think he'd be intrigued by it and see that there was that, you know, that the residual sort of thing of him was still there and still alive and still kicking in my studio. That Nureyev lives.